All right. Thanks for joining. This is Bill Quinn. I am joined today by SGAnon. SG, thank you so much for making time on what feels like a very interesting and potentially kind of important day in this grand scheme of things.
Well, I appreciate you having me back, Bill. It's good to be here. We are really coming into a hot 2025 Thanksgiving.
Aren't we so? So the last time we get together was September, and my original thinking for today was to talk about the emergence of a few names, a couple key ones that I thought would contribute to the discussion and that I think are important going forward. And then all of a sudden, someone, in this case, perhaps President Trump, has a new idea and tossed out some things overnight that I think are probably the most important things we can look at, but that dovetail into other things that we've seen in the past and that we will likely see going forward. So, with your permission, let's talk, if we can, about Trump's post over the last 24 hours. Is that all right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So, one of the ones that I wanted to key off of is he reposted this note from Glenn Beck. And let me read just a portion of it. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Glenn Beck posted this: Democrats just told our military not to follow unconstitutional orders while admitting none exist. Why is this a big deal? They knew and know that the message wasn't for our soldiers, it was for the global leadership. And we're going to show the video in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to just start there and get your initial impressions of this whole dialogue about, Congress people coming out and suggesting that in some way Trump is facilitating, maybe even issuing unlawful orders in their words. What do you think? What could be driving this?
Well, what is driving this is abject terror and panic, the likes of which patriots have not had the joy of witnessing along in this process until the present day and time. We went through the Biden years, which was essentially a giant brain scramble for the entirety of the world. It completely scrambled the compartmentalization inside worldwide military leadership. It certainly affected how heads of state interacted with one another and the United States of America. It affected the intelligence community in dramatic ways. It dramatically disempowered NATO and the advantages that NATO had on the battlefield with respect to like armament that was in back stock, for example, or energy weaknesses that hadn't been highlighted out for the world just yet. In other words, areas that could have been utilized for good or for ill, because you have to remember you're playing against an opponent that will cut off its own fingers if it can, or if it needs to, just in order to move the blob across the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're seeing now, in my opinion, is the acknowledgement from what we would call the globalist insurrection in all countries. And in the United States of America, it just happens to be mostly the Democrat left and the Democrat Party and all of the NGO base and corporate base that backs that up. But we're seeing that globalist insurrection now faced with its own mortality. And so what is happening are the panic moves that Q talked about a number of different times, where I think we're looking at potential suicides in the coming weeks and months as we look at these investigations beginning to ramp up. President Trump himself has called Adam Schiff numerous times a felon, a fraud. I think in the first Trump presidency, he even called him a traitor. We've seen some of these things, some of this rhetoric escalated in massive ways from the president just in the last 6 weeks against individuals, both that we thought were MAGA or that we're sort of accustomed to seeing as MAGA, and other individuals sort of along the same pale. And I would submit that a lot of that is the same type of espionage, brain scrambling warfare that we've seen playing out, confusing this globalist insurrection. And now the panic is setting in. Now we have individuals that are on armed services committee or subcommittees or staffing committees inside of the Congress that understand that some of the backdoor underhanded shadiness that they've been participating in or that they've been aware of, or even worse, protecting, is going to come out to light, and their names are going to be associated with it. This is not to make a direct allegation against any of the individuals in the video that they released. I think there were a number of senators and congresspeople that were in that video from the Democrat left calling for what amounted to defiance of the orders of the commander in chief. Mm-hmm. And the admission that no unlawful orders as yet to the present time exist, that is the key here. That's what makes it violative of 18 USC 2387 Armed Forces General. You cannot advise the military to defy orders, especially in an example where in a situation where no example of that exists. So this is going places in a big way, Bill. This is the bridging of the civilian unrest into the military criminality that we've talked about on this program and a number of others. Military is the only way. President Trump himself retruthed that just yesterday. The military is the only way to bypass a corrupt and defunct judiciary. And that is what I think we're going to have to look forward to here in the United States. But I want to qualify that statement really quick for your audience out there. This is something that, as we talk about it, I can envision a lot of patriots sitting in their armchair listening to this broadcast, absolutely hooting and hollering and celebrating finally being free of a corruption that seems to have its hand around the neck and around the fists and around the face of every good, hardworking, liberty-loving American out there. And while that is a cause for celebration in many ways, we have to keep in mind that the procession of events needed to arrive at that type of a place are very, very tumultuous, very turbulent, and they're going to be a bit frightening as we go forward.
I think all of that is spot on, SG. Thank you. So we've talked about this video. I want to take just a moment. I want to show the video, and then I want to show a response to this, because you will notice that they very carefully crafted their language so that they tried to skirt the overt violation of 18S USC 2387, is it? And so let me show this, and then we're going to show a response when somebody really gets asked about it.
I'm Senator Alyssa Slotkin.
Senator Mark Kelly.
Representative Chris DeLuzio.
Congresswoman Maggie Goodlander.
Representative Chrissy Houlihan.
Congressman Jason Crow. I was a captain in the United States Navy.
Former CIA officer.
Former Navy.
Former paratrooper and Army Ranger.
Former intelligence officer.
Former Air Force.
We want to speak directly to members of the military
And the intelligence community.
Who take risks each day
To keep Americans safe.
We know you are under enormous stress and pressure right now.
Americans trust their military.
But that trust is at risk.
This administration is pitting our uniformed military
And intelligence community professionals
against American citizens.
like us. You all swore an oath.
To protect and defend this Constitution.
And right now, the threats to our Constitution aren't just coming from abroad,
But from right here at home.
Our laws are clear. You can refuse illegal orders.
You can refuse illegal orders.
you must refuse illegal orders.
No one has to carry out orders that violate the law.
Or our Constitution.
We know this is hard.
And that it's a difficult time to be a public servant.
But whether you're serving in the CIA,
In the Army,
Our Navy,
The Air Force.
Your vigilance is critical.
and know that we have your back.
because now, more than ever,
The American people need you.
We need you to stand up for our laws.
our Constitution,
And who we are as Americans. Don't give up.
don't give up.
don't give up.
Don't give up the ship.
Very, very interesting. Notice that they were very careful to say, you may refuse illegal orders. Yet when you look carefully at the orders that have been given, none are illegal. And so Slotkin, who is, by the way, former CIA, hint, hint, goes on one of the regular mainstream shows and gets asked, do you know of any illegal orders? Here's her answer.
Right now, do you believe President Trump has issued any illegal orders?
To my knowledge, I am not aware of things that are illegal, but certainly there are some legal gymnastics that are going on with these Caribbean strikes.
Again, very carefully crafted answer. I'm not aware of any legal orders. So, it appears that, as you say, they don't know what else to do. So in a state of panic, this is the best thing they could come up with. And then overnight, Trump begins to clarify what's really going on. And he's using, and you used in your opening comments, a few quotes from the Q posts, which are now becoming literally, I think by the hour, maybe by the day, certainly, more well known to many. And as we go through this, I want to make sure that we do our job in helping them become aware and understand what Q posts are, even where they came from, when they started, and what they might be giving us signals to. So let me bring this up, and then I'll turn it back to you, SG. Here's Trump's post overnight, one of the ones, and it says, "Remember your oath." And in fact, all the military takes specific oaths to uphold the Constitution and carry out the commands, the orders of both their president and their ruling officers.
Well, it cut out on the audio there just a little bit a second ago, but I think what you're driving at here is with respect to the oath. President Trump, you know, when this entire journey began, and let's take it a little bit from the top here, Bill, because it sort of encapsulates where we have come to as a society, as a patriot movement, as an America First, patriot-led group of people and civilization here inside the United States. We've come a long way. President Trump came down the escalator a decade ago now. And as we look at what's occurred in that period of time, we have seen a dramatic shift in every facet of our society, from information to finance to business to international commerce to domestic commerce to international and domestic politics in major, major ways. We've seen exposure of corruption, the likes of which 10 years ago, people would have laughed at you. There's no way that something that heinous, that sadistic, that dark could actually be happening inside the United States of America. This is the land of the free, the home of the brave, the light of the world. That's just not happening here, right? That would have been the response from a great many people, and understandably so. And now as we've arrived at the point where we've seen the Doge audits, we've seen the USAID funnels, we've seen the Treasury Department, we've seen the corruption in law enforcement, we've seen the weaponization of the judiciary, the legislative branch, the Supreme Court in many ways with the 2020 election case that they refused to hear, brought by a state against another state. They're the only court in the land that could hear a case like that. And they refused to hear it at that time. And what we've seen, all through that period of time that came after that in the early 2020s here, we're halfway through this particular decade. All of it is building up to some sort of penultimate event. And the penultimate event really is best described as this: corruption versus freedom, corruption versus the right to self-determine and self-choose, greed versus a true laissez-faire, abundance-focused system, control versus liberty, right? This is the battle. Good versus evil is a good way to summarize it, but I like to use different adjectives because it helps to drive the point home a little bit. We're here so that we can decide what we want to have out of our life. And the choice, the honest, authentic choice, has never really been there. And we're only, many Americans just in the last 6 to 7, 8 years, really coming around to realizing that that's not actually been the case the entirety of their lives. So President Trump, along in this process, he took an oath as the commander-in-chief of the United States to defend the Republic and defend the United States Constitution, to uphold the laws of our land and the laws of our Constitution and all of that. And moving forward here, there's going to be a time when the commander-in-chief has to, for lack of a better term, has to remind the world what the true job of a leader really is. The true job of a leader is to preserve his nation and the people within it. The true job of a leader is not to serve an interest of any kind, be that internal or external. The true job of a leader is to look at the people that he has been elected to represent and uphold and lead, and protect them and protect their due process and the sacrosanct charter that they have as a result of this constitutional agreement between the people and the government. And that's going to have to come up at some point along the way, because we know that the only way, once again, sort of to go off on what I was saying a moment ago, the only way that you bypass a fully captured judiciary inside any society anywhere is a military court of justice. That's the only other option, because you have to have some level of enforcement capability. There has to be the ability to take the decisions of a legal body and then enforce those decisions and ensure the public safety and ensure the Republican form of government and ensure free and fair process and ensure transparent and fair elections and ensure that that Republican form of government and all things that emanate from it are protected and preserved. And so as we've watched the entirety of this year, and that video that you played just a moment ago sort of encapsulates exactly what we've seen, we are witnessing the masks coming off of the ideologues, the insurrectionists, the activists, and in many cases traitors, although not all, but in many cases traitors to our society, to our Constitution, and to the American people, who have occupied positions of power, both military and political. And so that's why this entire process had to expose the political and the civilian criminality just as much as the military criminality, or what we would call crimes against humanity or war crimes. It had to be all of the above, because you have individuals in all of these different arenas, many of them with overlap. Mark Kelly is a great example from that video just a moment ago. This is the guy who retired out of the Naval Service and went straight into NASA. I mean, come on, you're talking about an absolute globalist cutout puppet here. And so when we look at that particular caricature and that particular architecture, having co-opted the real balance of power and the real fairness and the system that the American people have come to know, trust, and believe that they themselves were the heirs apparent to, there has to be something that has to be done about that. And so we're witnessing the blending, if you will, of the jurisdictional component. You're witnessing the blending of the civilian and the military. You're witnessing the blending of societal disruption and unrest and the concept of insurrection. There's a difference between we've got some pockets of unrest that we can respond to versus we have a coordinated insurgency that has now turned into an insurrection, which we will not be able to respond to. And in my opinion, that's where we're headed from a public reveal standpoint.
I think that's right on. Very interestingly, and in direct alignment with what you just said, Trump posted this yesterday, and that is a review of a meme by Steele, RD_Steele 1974. And here's what it says: if your justice system has been corrupted, how do you bypass the corruption? And he reminds us in this meme, military tribunals. And as a picture, that is a picture of the Nuremberg trials. And in many cases, over the last few days, people have reminded the public about Nuremberg and what it was structured around. In many cases, the charges wrapped around human rights abuses. And notably, one of Trump's key executive orders, 13818, was one of those magical orders that he enacted in 2017. He renewed it in 18 and 19 and 20. And yet Biden renewed it, according to what we can see in the documents, in 21, 22, 23, and 24. So it stands in force today, and it in part blocks property of people that are found to be in violation of human rights abuses, but it also extends the capability of the U.S. to enforce many of the other sanctions against people who will have committed or will have been found to commit these kinds of heinous crimes. It's amazing. You know, you look back, one of the things that I find fascinating are some of the quotes that come from the Q post, one of which is future proves past. A lot of people didn't know what that meant or couldn't conceive of what it meant when it first came out, but now it begins to show that over the course of time, while we might have guessed dozens of times what something might mean, now as we get into what we now know to be the future, if you will, we can see what things meant. And it just begs the question, gosh, what's the rest of it going to mean as we understand more? It really is a fascinating process. And some people, I think, are wary, scared, perhaps in some ways. They're like, how could this be? How could they have known this stuff was going on? And yet, you know, over the course of the last months, I think we spoke about it briefly last time, he's been posting little Q snippets for quite a long time, but now the pace picks up. And overnight, he posted, I think, 4, 5, 6, 7 in various forums to remind people that, you know, time's a ticking, and the time is almost up for the bad guys. What a fascinating, what an engaging time. As long as you're comfortable with, you know, this means something. This isn't just happenstance, and it's not just some psyop that, you know, the Trump administration came up with. This goes back now, at least 8 years, and probably a lot longer than that. To you, SG.
Well, it does. I mean, as far as the actual existence of the entity that we refer to as Q, we learned publicly of that existence in 2017. I believe it was the 28th of October when Q came online. But the lead up to something like what we call the Q operation is decades in the making. It's decades in the planning. And the reason you can tell that is because the level of precision required to forecast and then execute a battle plan and a battle sequence of events that plays out predictably in the public space, that's a long time in planning and observation. You have to have your statistics really, really aligned. You have to have all of your variables counted and recounted and recounted again. And quite frankly, you need, I think, serious algorithmic processing power to handle all of the input that's going to be coming in a campaign like that. So when we look at Q as an entity itself, is it a psyop? It absolutely is, but it's not a psyop that Trump conceived. It's a psyop that was put together by what I would characterize as breakaway patriots, individuals that were able to avoid the corruption of the globalist bureaucracy inside both the government and the military sectors, and not just in the United States of America. Russia is actually a major player in this regard. And those individuals have always understood that the true adversary of humanity is not some social issue or some, far away military threat somewhere. It is, in fact, the control centers of the world and how that control is exercised and concentrated. And so when you look at the control of money, for example, and what money in the US dollar fiat reserve system has done to the planet just in the last 100 years, it's not hard to trace back the problem to its source, right? That's a relatively recent memory case study when we look at the past millennium as sort of the trough that we're going to draw from here. Another example is bloodline power and bloodline influence inside of governments in the background, right? The royals have been in control of continental Europe publicly, really, up until the present day. And really up until a couple of hundred years ago, they had a lot of absolute control. There was a lot of direct from the court to the fist, from the fist to the people sort of control that happened. And those bloodlines were heavily insular, heavily concentrated, and heavily ingratiated with the same concentrated interests over finance and money that I just referenced a moment ago. So the group of individuals, or a group or a broad subclass of individuals out there in the world, both government and civilian, in my opinion, over the last 40 to 50 years, understood what the problem was, and after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, realized that they need to get their act in gear or humanity is going to end up extinct. And so at this particular point, as we've come to this point now, what has that Q operation done? Well, it has woken up the entirety of the Western world, slowly at first, but more and more rapidly. It has caused serious political and governmental shift. A great many of the predictions, I mean dozens of predictions that were given in the Q boards have come to pass, both in the real time as those posts were coming out during the first Trump presidency and in the modern time now. We saw Q talk about a Democrat power implosion. We're literally watching that on full display. We're watching the erosion and destruction, the slow, painful, erasure of a very large beast, mentally, philosophically, and ideologically in the entirety of the population. And the concept of being a Democrat in the present sense, in the modern sense, in the current political ideology of the American population, it will not exist when this process is over. So looking at what's happening, I would say that President Trump posting things like that, those are not really meant for us, right? We're believers. A great many people that watch this show, we sort of get it. There's a lot of patriots out there that are still skeptical of Q, but they're willing to acknowledge, and I have a family member that's like this, they're willing to acknowledge, yeah, well, that seems really odd. That's sort of difficult to explain in any other fashion. Maybe it's real, maybe it's not. I'm not going to stake a claim on it because I don't want to be that person. I'm not going to put myself out there like that, but maybe it is. And so you're seeing a lot of that coming around in the population, and that makes those posts not really for us. It makes them for the other side. It makes them a billboard for, which path are you going to choose? This is your window of mercy. This is your window of time where you do get to pick a side. This has been a years-long process now. Many of these conversations are now officially years old. We talk about COVID, for example. We talk about the election fraud situation. These are half-decade-old concepts now at this point. There's going to come a time where the clock does, in fact, run out.
Yeah. One of the things that's fascinating, you talked about, how over time things get shown. One of the things that I found fascinating, there's been a couple of times when something would happen within the Q regime, if you will, and then it would exhibit itself in the real world. And one of my favorites is around Easter time, just before Easter, I think it was 18. One of the nons had said, "Can we get any kind of proof?" We were at that stage where even the early followers were questioning stuff, and they said, "Can we get any kind of proof? Could you get Trump to say something like, I don't know, tippy top," which nobody ever uses that term. It's a really unusual term. And in fact, MJ Truth posted this recently, talking about the time that this happened. So there was this request, and it was in the boards at first. And then comes the Easter celebration. Trump stands out in the balcony, and here's what he says.
Keep this incredible house or building or whatever you want to call it, because there really is no name for it. It is special. And we keep it in tip-top shape. We call it sometimes tippy-top shape. And it's a great, great place.
And then, of course, there's other times when he said tippy-top sense, just as kind of a, as you say, kind of a gotcha reminder to the bad guys. You know, we've told people, they're getting it. They are listening and paying attention. Just, you know, just fascinating. One of the dynamics that we started, I almost was going to lead with this when we were going to get together earlier. And I want to go back a little bit to it because he started posting again in response to some of Trump's posts overnight. There is a gentleman who is one of the heads of Russia's economic development efforts and has actually met with the Trump administration here early on, back in the August-September timeframe. But then as Trump got more and more overt about his posts, this gentleman, who is actually a special envoy directly from Putin, so he has direct contact, direct relationship with Putin, starts backing up Trump's own posts, especially when they have to do with Q. And it leads us to a couple of questions that I think are critical in this discussion. So bear with me for a second. I want to make sure we get to the right place here. And here we go. This is Kirill Dmitriev. And back when, this goes back to the early October timeframe, he's the one who says the CIA just declassified documents that reveal that Vice President Biden intervened to suppress an internal report exposing alleged corruption by his family in Ukraine. Now, many of us kind of knew about this, but for those that weren't paying attention, he went on to post more about exactly what Biden had disclosed in his statements, kind of bragging about being able to kill an investigation that was going on into Burisma. What is Burisma? Company that his son was working for and that many were tied to. So we checked at the time, who is Kirill Dmitriev? We wanted to make sure as close as we could. Is this really the gentleman we think it is? And he posted a number of things from his Twitter account. And then over the course of the following days and in fact weeks into October, comes word that there is to be a disclosure to Anna Paulina Luna, in part of the subject of and following a meeting that he had with Anna Paulina Luna, and she talks about a document that's on the way to her. And bear with me, I just want to make sure we get the right place. And here we go. This is Anna Paulina Luna, a House rep from Florida. She says, I have officially confirmed a meeting with Kirill Dmitriev, special envoy to the president of Russia. She has this meeting. And then very shortly thereafter, she gets this thank you. And he says, thank you for your courageous stand for peace and dialogue. Very interesting. And then he posts this. What? And guess where it comes from? What if China, Russia, and others are coordinating with POTUS? Now, keep in mind, this gentleman is a special envoy from Putin. What if China, Russia, and others are coordinating with POTUS to eliminate the NWO, which we understand to mean New World Order? Might have a different word for the yen, but we'll stay away from that for the moment. And then this post asks, who controls what we think is North Korea? Who really controls North Korea? What an amazing thing for this gentleman to post. He's from a different country, and he's pulling this from, guess where? The Q posts. Unreal at the time. And little did we know what was going to be disclosed shortly thereafter. But let me get your comments there first, and then we'll go a little bit deeper, because I want to show something that came out after his discussions and things with Anna Paulina Luna matured a little bit more.
Well, it's difficult to sort of follow up on that pictographic sequence that you showed because it just speaks for itself, Bill. And that's where we're at, I think, with respect to our journey together here. I think that we have to acknowledge there arrives a point where it is more intellectually immature to refuse to see the impossible patterns that are playing out, right? The overlap that statistically cannot be random chance. It cannot be chaos in some sort of disorganized or unplanned fashion. There has to be an organization to it. And when we look at Russia, this is not surprising at all that, Q mentioned Russia directly as well as China. Russia and China constitute a great deal of the world's military, industrial, and economic force outside of the United States. Realistically, if you wanted to refire the entirety of the planet, both economically and politically, you could not do it without Russia and China. There's too many trade routes that are controlled. There's too much resource management underneath the same roof. There's way too much military power. You've got active space programs going back decades, even with China's that's just a little bit lesser well known. So looking at what's happening right now in the public space with an envoy to the Russian president declaring many times over a longitudinal period, now several months, that he understands that President Trump is Q+. He highlighted that a number of times over the summer. He's thrown homage to, like you showed just a moment ago, posting literal Q drops, resharing pictures of Trump posting Q drops. I know a relatively small-time podcaster, phenomenal guy who is all bought in with the Q and the Anons, and he's a phenomenal researcher, and he's a great communicator, and he's commented very, succinctly and very professionally on a couple of Envoy Dmitriev's posts and actually received a direct response. So this is a dynamic that has been built around a singular concept, which is world peace and world freedom, the ability for humanity to actualize its potential, to live up to what we really can be. And there are individuals across all governments, believe it or not, in all various nation states and sectors that are for their people and are for their cultures, but they're not militant about it, and they want to see everybody succeed and prosper. And that's really what about this entire Great Awakening, that's what it's supposed to be all about. We're transitioning from a world where we sort of looked at resources as finite and conflict as inevitable. And now we're looking into a world where conflict is obsolete and resources can really, truly be infinite.
I know it is incredibly fascinating. Let me continue on just a little bit with what transpired with Mr. Dmitriev. We saw this from Anna Paulina Luna a few days later. This is on October 14th, about a week after the post we just showed. My office just received word from the Russian Embassy USA that the ambassador from Russia will be hand delivering the essentially the government document from Russia that was developed back immediately following JFK's assassination, on who assassinated JFK, to my office. This is a 350-page document. And over the course of the following 24 hours, in fact, that document was delivered. It was quickly translated and was made available both in Russian, if folks wanted to translate it themselves, or in translated form to the American public. And what it said was not as much, in my mind, about who assassinated JFK, but perhaps more about what whoever did it was trying to stop. And within the document, they found some very fascinating charts. Here's one. This documents that there was a potential plan, if you will, for something called the Kennedy-Khrushchev World Peace Bridge. And on lower on the diagram, it says must be built at once. So most people have now learned that Russia and the U.S. territories are only a couple of miles apart across a small portion of the Bering Sea. And during winter, it's actually, you can walk across because it's frozen. But imagine if this were the potential, were JFK to have not been assassinated. Was this a possibility? Was this a future that could have actualized for America? And if so, what might it have meant? And we hear words like peace and we hear collaboration, but imagine what was taken if, in fact, this was a potential if Kennedy had been here. Here's what appears to be a portion of the bridge, and down at the bottom you can see that this is labeled Eternal Peace. And then we find this picture of Kennedy and Khrushchev. Go back to the 60s. I doubt it was photoshopped. It looks like they were together and appeared to be enjoying one another's company. Was this what we were not supposed to see? Was this what we were not supposed to actualize? It is notable that we're right after the anniversary of JFK's assassination, but imagine for just a moment what might have been. So back to you, SG.
Well, I think that you're hinting at something there, Bill, that is really, it's transcendent, it's esoteric, it's spiritual at its core. And yes, the world would have looked dramatically different. Excuse me. Now, what I want to say about this, though, is something that I find very interesting, and the impact to bring this full circle now could not come, in my opinion, at a better time. Again, tying back to that idea of military brilliance, precise planning. This is a period of time that in some ways does have sort of a predetermined sequence of events at some levels, especially in politics. But in other ways, it's entirely organically driven. It's event driven based on how things transpire within the population and what people choose. And that's why and I'm setting up what I'm about to say here really importantly for the context, because what people choose has to come from a clear understanding of the dynamics of what the world is and what the possibilities really, truly are. If I'm a college student with, a broad array of various classes and choices and things like that, I have much more to choose from than a student that is in a vocational training or a very narrow discipline to learn that focus very vertically and very deeply. Neither one of them is wrong or good or bad. It is just that one choice is going to be completely different than the other choice based on the overall awareness of what the choices are. So if the choice is for me to go up to Seattle, Washington, and then decide that I want to take a 6 or 7 day vacation and drive to Russia, that is a completely different concept for the American consciousness than has ever existed before. This idea of East and West is literally the Republican-Democrat binary at the macro civilizational scale. It is the international sleight of hand, if you will. This idea that there has to be a hostile East and a magnanimous West, or that there has to be a corrupt West and a rising East, right? We're grappling right now with not overbalancing our own pendulum, right? We want balance. That's the goal here. We want everybody to have the ability to move forward freely, fairly, and honestly within their respective societies without the need for conflict to fuel their economy or their public safety. And so when we look at what's happening with respect to Russia and Trump right now, with respect to President Putin, look at President Trump rolled the red carpet out literally for President Putin. And he gives Zelensky a fist bump style handshake and grabs his elbow and asks him if he put on a nice shirt today when he comes to the office. I mean, it's a completely different level of honorific and respect. There's a totally different level of camaraderie there, and it's palpable and it's visible. And frankly, it drives the left crazy because the left are working on the behalf of the endless war complex. So if you were to build a tunnel or a bridge of some kind between Alaska and Russia, and then extend that operation down the coast of British Columbia, perhaps even out in international waters if Canada doesn't want to, pitch in on something like that, whatever it happens to be. If you had that type of access way between our continents, the idea, the consciousness, the mindset understanding of what Russia is and what America is would fundamentally shift in both nations. It would shift in Russia, and it would shift inside the United States of America. And the level of good that an aligned Russian and American population could export to the world, bringing the Chinese hopefully right along as a great third, I don't think you can comprehend. I don't think we can comprehend that, Bill. We've never lived in a world where that type of aligned uniformity of purpose, but diversity of skill set, talent, and resource has ever been presented to humanity.
Well, it's notable that when people can spend time together, whether it be Russians and Americans or whether it be Europeans and Americans, it's easy to see the commonality. It's easy to see the common will and wishes for themselves, for their families. And by keeping folks separate, by creating division, it would seem that maybe the bad guys have been fostering that to prevent us from knowing that there's so much crossover. It's, you go back in history and you learn that Russia has been typically one of the most Christian countries in the world. And yet, there's been periods where certain revolutions, certain dynamics have attempted to take away that focus, to turn it more toward, communism and other things where, the notion even of religion becomes, it grayed out into the background. The famous quote, I guess, from Karl Marx and company, religion is the pablum of the masses. But is it really? No, it's really not. Faith is the underpinning of many countries and was so important early on in America. Maybe that's one of the reasons that they want us to become unglued and to be expunged from the planet. Too much faith, too much faith-based population within the U.S., and maybe one of the reasons they've been trying to undo that and put every possible thing they could in front of us to make us question that faith. You brought up the notion of what we might achieve together. Here, there's a chart that got put together immediately following the release of that report. And it just gives a sense of, well, how much of the world could you touch with an economic program in one form or another based on infrastructure, if in fact you could move from essentially our part of the Aleutian Islands over to Russia. I mean, it's amazing. So many places could do business together that today you basically have to circumnavigate the rest of the globe in order to get goods or other things to move from place to place. So it is notable. And then, of course, if you look at the downside, what did we experience with Kennedy's absence? Well, we started escalating in Vietnam. So tens of thousands of Americans lost their lives, hundreds of thousands, maybe more. Asians lost their lives. Why? Why was that so important in the retrospect of things? Why have we seen so many, endless wars since? Some and many, perhaps, seemingly based on falsities. Look at there's, weapons of mass destruction sitting in Iraq. Oh, were there? Well, now that we know that there doesn't appear to be, what does that mean? Why were we there? As we go forward, we can't ignore, in my mind, the fact that Trump has already created 8 solutions to conflict around the world, bordering on 9 now, if in fact he's able to pull off the Ukraine-Russia thing. What do you think might be coming next? This peace breaking out seems to be one of the key themes in Trump's plans. How do you see that, SG?
Well, it's interesting, and this is going to lead me back to the conversation we were having a little bit earlier in the call today, where we talked about a lot of these sequence of events, at least domestically in the United States. They have to play out to a point of discomfort, to a point where the public really begins to pay attention. They want to participate in the process. They need and want to know more about it, and they're willing to do so. And that's going to respond, I think, in a great many ways, Bill, to what happens in the international space. The international space is the space where we're talking that we have to think in, and we have to get ourselves up into that level of consciousness when we're talking about balancing the entirety of the world. And Q tells us very plainly and very directly, Drain the Swamp is not just about Washington, D.C. This is about a corruption that has infested itself worldwide. And in addition to participating in literal, physical, kinetic evil, they have also managed to enslave the entirety of the planet through those systems that we've talked about. And breaking away from those systems and simultaneously adding ether and ignition to new systems, I think that's going to do exactly what you talked about. We've witnessed that process as well under the Biden administration. It continues to accelerate with quantum computing, artificial intelligence, all of the different money poured into infrastructure mapping and conceptualization and magnetic levitation and electromagnetic propulsion technology and all of these sorts of things, right? That's inevitably going to break out to a world peace standpoint. But I don't think we arrive at world peace without a number of sputters in the engine along the way. And I think that that's the era that we're in right now, right? We've seen sputters with the Israel-Gaza situation. We've seen sputters in sub-Saharan Africa. We're seeing many individuals' faith tested at least at that surface level consciousness in Eastern Europe with respect to what's going on in Ukraine. From my angle, and I'm still standing by this even today, and I've taken a lot of flack for it, but Russia will not conclude the Ukrainian conflict without taking possession of Odessa. And if they cannot get Odessa in a peace agreement on paper, they will take Odessa by military force. Odessa is a 1,000-year-old Russian city. The individuals there, over 80% of them identify themselves as Russian. They have experienced phenomenal persecution, and they are the premier Black Sea port on that side of the Black Sea for importation and exportation of all sorts of resources. It's a port city. It has a long history of that. So there's no way that this conflict concludes without a transference of that. And I could see the same happening with Vilnius for similar reasons, but more from an interior land standpoint rather than a port city standpoint. There's a lot of railroads that go through Vilnius. There's a lot of resources in Lithuania, and Vilnius is another 700 and some odd year old city that identifies itself primarily as Russian, even to this present day. 6 in 10 citizens, after enduring the propaganda bombardment of NATO over the last however many years, even now, 60+% of their citizens identify themselves ancestrally and ethnically as Russians first. So looking at what's going on right now in Eastern Europe and that sort of the sputters along the path to peace, we may see some hot zones. We may see some hotbeds. We may see a few days where tensions escalate, or a few weeks where things are sort of trepidatious at the international level. We have impending military action right now in the Caribbean. And I can assure your audience out there, while narco-terrorists are certainly being targeted for their activities, this is not only about narco-terrorism. Venezuela is on the State Department's Tier 3 human trafficking report and has been for a number of years, really going back since the early 1990s. There's a great deal of extremely sadistic and salacious evil that goes on the ground in Venezuela, and it's a veritable playhouse for the intelligence community that fled to South America in the aftermath of the Second World War and sort of reinvented themselves as paramilitarized actors, profiting off of the activities of these cartels that are trafficking not only in drugs, but in weapons and biological agents and organs and blood and people and all of these sorts of things. And it's happening on the ground in Venezuela. So there's a lot more going on with respect to that and in the entirety of the Caribbean than what we're being told. And the same can be applied logically to all of these other arenas around the world. And so those hot zones are going to have to be publicly visible first to provide some sort of response from the people, to give the people a choice on what they want. Do they want more of this or do they not want more of this? At the same time that this is happening, there are patriotic aims in some regards, in some areas that are being met and that are being met in many cases for the first time. The elimination of the child sex slavery and exportation industry in South America is certainly on the table, in my opinion, based on where we're at with this. But it's also providing the public the optical experience, the real world progression through a sequence of events that is not what they would like, so that they can choose purposefully and honestly and particularly something better than that. So that ultimately culminates in world peace, which is where I think all of us want to go anyway. And when you add the economics into that, the transition of finance from fiat to real, the transition of currency from paper to some sort of paper hybrid or digital paper metal hybrid of some form, whatever it happens to be, I think at that point, that's when you have the combination, if you will, the soup in the cauldron to actually get world peace to stick rather than being a fleeting idea.
Yeah. It's interesting too that in the midst of all this other stuff going on, the whole notion of the Epstein files, the Epstein client list, all of the stuff around Epstein continues to bubble in the background. And we saw cases where Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene came out and said, oh, we're going to make sure the client list is exposed, even if the government won't do it. Well, did they do that? No. But we stand here today still waiting to see what's going to pop out of this. And it just, if you look at some of the other members of the community, if you will, that track and try to bring out truth, they are suggesting that this is going to be darker, more troubling than many can really prepare for. And it does feel like, you know, there's forces behind here that have done everything they possibly could to make sure that much of this information did not and does not come out. Yet, like everything else, it feels like it's going to come to naught, and we indeed will see what needs to be seen about what's been going on. And I doubt it's going to be easy for many people to recognize and come to grips with. What do you think?
Well, I think the delay on Epstein, I think at this point, Bill, is twofold. And I've had a lot of time to reflect on this. This has been a bit of a tumultuous year for me. I'm finally getting back in the saddle, really now, just coming into the end of the year. Mm-hmm. But I've had a lot of time to reflect, but I've had a lot of time to reflect on on this particular issue. And something that went through the media cycle very recently, but not a lot of people really drilled down on, and I think it's worth drilling down on, is the fact that Epstein was tied to influencing the proceedings of an impeachment of the president of the United States, right? The proceedings that led up to that entire scenario. Mm-hmm. And the influence was connected directly to a congresswoman who was receiving instructions from Epstein directly on how to frame and ask specific questions of the individual she was questioning at the time. And I can't remember, forgive me, if it was President Trump or someone else. But with respect to that, what that does is it elevates, in my mind, the level of control and influence that Epstein and those in his orbit actually exercised over Washington, D.C. and over the president of the United States. And that becomes military jurisdiction when that power is exercised to overthrow a sitting president. And so what we've got now, in my opinion, is a multi-tier investigation process that kicked off years and years ago and has been mapping all sorts of different activities, both of a civilian nature and a military nature, in different jurisdictional and focalized resource-capable areas. It's like you wouldn't have the FBI investigating certain military crimes, and you wouldn't have the military investigating all, maybe some, but not all of the types of criminality that the FBI would be better equipped to do, especially from a personnel provision standpoint. But looking at that, the Epstein operation seems to suggest that we have not only crimes against children, not only pedophilia and blackmail that is in control of a great many members of the government and also of academia, big finance, big business, law schools, prominent laboratories and medical labs, people that worked at the Mayo Clinic. All this stuff has now been connected back to Epstein in some form or some fashion. But we also have that same blackmail centralized locus of control, of which Epstein was a part, but not the end point, also had control of the functionalities of the Congress in a way that accelerated or facilitated, maybe is a better way of expressing it, the attempted overthrow of the United States government. Mm-hmm. And so we have now a broad investigative apparatus that plays into this. We have foreign intelligence that has been implicated in this, not only Israeli. We've had British intelligence implicated in shielding Epstein. We've had French intelligence implicated in shielding Epstein. We've certainly had CIA implicated by former attorney, I believe his name was Acosta, where he was told basically to back off because Epstein was intelligence. That's what he was literally told. And this testimony was given again in a variation of that before the United States Congress not that long ago. He was called in to give some questions on this very matter. So this whole Epstein situation, I understand that patriots are desperate to see it come out. I understand that Anons, who have been wide awake to the levels of what's actually been going on for a long time, they're frankly getting tired of not seeing it come out. It becomes very tiresome. The burden of knowledge can be very difficult. But this is a massive, massive insurrection that took place long ago. This was a cancer that grew inside the United States government and has long usurped our actual representative form of things. And so the levels of reality that have to sort of be walked around and walked out with respect to the breadth of investigations, both military and non, that have to be seen all the way through. It would not surprise me if it takes us a few more months, even into spring of 2026, to have serious clarity on some of this issue, because it's going to tie back again to the Gang of Eight. It's going to tie back to Adam Schiff. It's going to tie back to the impeachments of President Trump. It's going to tie back to Russiagate. It's going to tie all of it together. And I don't believe Barack Obama's White House is off the table either.
I'm right with you. All the indications are Obama is going to be right in the center of the proceedings. I wanted to share with folks where they can find more of what you are posting and bringing out. Go ahead and take us through that, if you would, please, SG.
Certainly. I can be found online in 4 places as of the present moment, 4 authentic places. The podcast itself is hosted mainly on Rumble. So that's rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SGAnon. I can be found on Truth Social by SGAnon at the handle real, REAL, SGAnon with the red check mark. I can be found on X with the username SGAnon and a handle of THEQ News Patriot with a blue check mark. And I can also be found on Telegram at t.me/real, REAL, Q News Patriot. I'm not on Telegram by the name SGAnon either.
Okay, thank you for that. And we would highly recommend, especially now as things are getting to fever pitch, sort of. I would recommend that if you aren't following, you do pick your favorite platform and make SG one of the folks that you carefully look at and look frequently, because you're bringing out things almost every day, aren't you, SG? So it's it really is valuable and helps keep people up to speed. And as we started the conversation with it makes, I think, people feel more comfortable when they at least have some semblance of, oh, okay, I'm beginning to see how these pieces fit. Last thoughts, SG, as we get ready to close, sir.
Well, I think you sort of just hinted right there at what my last thoughts would be. People are still waking up. People are still coming across from left to right, and then the people that come to the right, the more conservative right. I'm not talking about the right side. I'm talking about the more conservative right viewpoint, politically and ideologically. They are then waking up to gravitational levels of corruption that make partisan politics completely irrelevant. All of us understand that criminality against children is instinctively wrong. There's not a healthy, balanced adult in the entirety of the world, in my opinion, that would not look at that particular act and decide that that was something they had to intervene with and stop. It's literally in the DNA. It's programmed within us by the Holy Spirit to carry us forward as creation and with creation, right? So that's one of those things that people are realizing has been going on now, and they're having a hard time coming around to it. The same can be true of different arenas, of different areas of the awakening, back to financial and the Federal Reserve and Jekyll Island and all of these other things. And so you have this gamut, this spectrum where people come from blue-haired and gaslit to less blue-haired and gaslit to conservative in their presentation about constitutional rights and principles to more conservative in their presentation about beliefs and principles and how they're going to live their values out. And then that transitions itself usually into this acceptance that there are some core issues that are wrong with our society that we cannot allow to continue. A beautiful example of this, actually, this process that I'm talking about, Bill, is Anna Kasparian. She's an incredible journalist that is over at TYT. It's a program called The Young Turks. And she started off absolutely as leftist, as progressive as you can get, all bought in on every talking point from the Democrat left, and very hostile to the outside talking points, so much so that she actually has engaged in different what I would call combative rhetoric with individuals based solely on their perspective and not the merits of their argument. She has since come a tremendous long way and had a conversation not so long ago with Tucker Carlson about this same process that I'm talking to you about right now. People are realizing that they were sold a bill of goods, that they don't really like what they have anyway, that there's problems in their communities that nobody's talking about on both sides, but that everyone can visibly see. And it's time we start admitting those out loud and then having the conversation amongst ourselves. How do we solve these problems and bypass the elected leadership in a lawful manner? In other words, how can we bring our resources to bear? And one of those ways we can is to run for office and to get elected and to become the individual with the power and with the influence and to not forget where we came from. And that is what the entirety of this whole process, going back to 2016, 2015, Trump coming down the escalator, all of the way until the present day, that's what it's all about. Getting us back into power as a we the people collective in the Western world capable of holding the reins and remembering where we came from.
Wow. Wonderful thoughts. And gosh, I hope people are taking it to heart. We see that in many sectors now. I can see it as we come up to elections for local office and for U.S. offices going into 2026. I see people getting involved in ways that they have not been before. And I hope that will be pervasive across the country and very frankly beyond. So SG, once again, thank you for being with us. It is a pleasure and an honor, and we will look forward to having you back very soon. And I'm sure, as always, we'll have plenty to discuss. Thank you for being with us, sir.
Thank you for having me, Bill. Good to be here. God bless all.